Hotep. Shalom, salam alaikum, and namaste. So many ways we have to say hello, good evening. So many ways. And some of these things about many ways you'll hear me talk about. But I cannot begin really without just saying thank you, MOLEFI. And this thank you is not simply a thank you for the opportunity to address this community today, but it's a thank you for all you do. You know, what every one of us in this room represents is a profound challenge every day, to walk through the world with human dignity. And there are those out there who will want to stomp, spit on us, put us down, and many of us get broken. But what inspires many of us to keep going, to get up, is a profound act of love, not simply for the self, but for a community that ultimately is able to get up each day because each of us has. When we think about what inspires us to do our work, some people ask me, who do you think about when you write or you do your work, Louis? And without hesitation, I can't help otherwise. I think about our ancestors who faced what it was to have their lives ripped apart, put over the Middle Passage, and to be placed in a foreign land, and to be told that you will never ever be who you are. And so for those of us who fight to assert that, you see, what you do, MOLEFI, is not simply fight that struggle, but you add to that struggle a profound act of memory, because your message is also remember who you are. So I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm talking about quite a few things, all right? And among the things I'm talking about is, I hope, things that will be of some use to you as you face similar struggles existentially and intellectually. And what I mean by that, of course, is every one of us who makes a decision to deal with intellectual work often finds ourselves in a neurotic situation. The neurotic situation is pretty much this. There's a struggle. There's a world out there that's stepping on us and telling us we don't have a right to be. And of course, we fight. But as you're fighting, of course, fighting takes up a lot of time. And as you're fighting, somewhere along the line, among the things that are thrown at you is, well, you're good for what is involved in the physicality of the body. Mm-hmm. It's fine if you're on the street. It's fine if you're simply speaking. It's fine if at the end of the day, whatever you do stops wherever you are physically located. But then there's a profound smile, because then there are those who offered something to humankind that goes across generations. They offer words. They offer ideas. And some of those ideas, every one of you get up each morning and hear, are so valuable that all of humankind should have those ideas. And those people who do that get venerated as the necessary intellectual nutrition for life, for thought, for our humanity. And then they tell you that supposedly none of them are black. So what do you do when you're black struggling for your dignity, for your life, but then you are now told that life can never transcend itself into the form of a gift, a profound gift to humanity of thought? So then you decide, well, you better think. You better produce some thought. Because as we know, action without thought is blind. So you go and you think, you go and you write, you go and do that. And of course, the energy it takes to do real thinking is a lot of energy. So then someone will come up to you and say, what are you doing all that thinking? Why aren't you in the streets?
Oh, right.
That's the neurotic situation. Now, of course, you could talk about both and. But, you know, the world is full of traps. And if you're going to talk about both and, what it is really to think, really to do these, you have to ask yourself, from that profound act of love, what it means and why it's necessary to answer that question. You see, that question, how does an intellectual relate to practice, is a question that's asking you to justify what you do. And any intellectual who's afraid of justification is not worth her or his salt. We need to be able to answer such a question. So when I do my work, I take it for granted that my work must be questioned, that I have to justify myself. And when I was doing this work, there's some things I came across. For instance, when I first began to look at work around the question of Black existentialism or African diasporic existentialism, there are people who even laughed at me. They thought existentialism is some European idea. And they thought, what's the point of all that when you need to deal with the question of the streets? But I said to myself, well, let's just try to understand what people think. What do people have to say? And when I went back, I didn't go and just say, let me go read what a group of famous Black intellectuals from the 19th and the 18th and the 17th and the 16th and the 15th centuries all the way back to antiquity had to say. But I also went to look at what people who didn't think anybody would listen to them had to say. And you know, those people leave their messages behind. They're our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers. They're our cousins. They're even people we never met, but they were the servant of someone, and they left something sitting in some kitchen somewhere in the 19th century. And it somehow makes its way back to us. And as I looked at all of these things, I noticed certain patterns. Every time I would look at these things, I noticed there were Black people constantly, in some way or form, inscribing the words, I am a human being. You know? And when you think about what it is, not only to say I am a human being, but to assert your humanity, you require to have profound tools of courage. Because there's a world that wants you so much not to be a human being that there were even laws against you learning to read and write.
That's right.
Okay? And so as I went and looked at those, I began to see something. Of course this makes sense. Of course a group of people who are told they're not people, a group of people whose humanity is brutalized, of course the most important question to those people is not only the question of what is a human being and the assertion of being a human being, but also the profound question of what is going on with people who try to govern what it is to be a human being. And so that first question, the in reality, in the end of the day, what am I? That's a profoundly existential question. And so the way I look at the question of existence is not in terms of applying some thought of a European thinker, and it's not that European thinkers don't ask those questions. But I look at it, to begin with, from what it is to deal in flesh, blood, and fear and trembling of what it is to be in a world that is hostile to your existence. And how do you stand up and live each day as a human being in that world? So for me, the question of Black existentialism is not something Black people get from anywhere. It's something that animates out of our struggles. So this brings up something that also Professor Asante. No, I thought about my colleague, someone wrote me about Professor Mahante, because he's going through a very profound illness. But Asante brought up is that Asante reminds us that when people talk about modern and postmodern, all those things, what they fail to understand is that the kind of struggles that generated black thought were modern through and through, precisely because prior to the emergence of a world that kidnapped and enslaved us and tried to rename us, there was no reason for Africans to have had the designation black, brown, or green, to have even had the designation African.
That's right.
So once we understand that these problematics, there was no reason for those people to have gone through the notion that they were not human being. The very problem of trying to articulate your humanity emerged in the historical fact of its being challenged. And that becomes that unique modern enterprise, but it's a modern enterprise that's not in the form of a kind of distant, flashy modern. It's about a modern that looks to the underside of the modern and challenge its hegemony. You see? And so we start with that first part. They say we're not human, but if we say I'm as human as you, we would have been entrapped in the very project of making that the standard of our humanity.
That's right. Absolutely.
What we have to say is you who believe that you have the right to challenge my humanity are exemplifying a low standard of what it is to be human. And if we understand that, then we come back and we ask ourselves, if I am going to assert my humanity, what does it mean to do so with love, compassion, and dignity instead of simply being reactive? It means then I now have to interrogate what it is for there to be a standard of a human being to begin with. And as I do that, I begin to find myself facing something else that makes absolute sense to hold dear under such challenges. Because you don't shackle, enslave, step on, spit on, and dehumanize people, and they don't, in every fiber of their body, think about that sacred concept with which we all struggle to this day, and that is freedom. And once you begin to think about freedom, and you think about the question of how freedom, you have to say freedom for whom? Freedom for what? And as you begin to think about it, you begin to ask yourself, what is it about the human being I am that will create a unique demand on freedom? And the moment you begin to do that, you begin to also ask, what is it you're doing when you asking about those things? We're right back at those justificatory practices. We begin to say, justify yourself. But you know what we do when we do that? We're also saying those who have challenged and abused us, justify yourself. And you know the moment you ask that, they can't win. Because there's no justification for that. They're not God. There's no justification for that. Well, that is what, in brief outline, I mean when I say black existentialism. Because it means demanding justification for justification itself. It means demanding an understanding of freedom and liberation. It means demanding an understanding of what it means to be human. And it means also something more radically profound. It means also taking seriously the responsibility for what it is to take on such a difficult task. It means, think about it, there's nothing more awesome and difficult and frightening than not only being responsible, but being responsible for responsibility itself. The idea that if you don't do something, it isn't going to be done. That at the end of the day, no matter how you're beaten, whipped, humiliated, attacked, that which is ethical, right, good, and fundamental in the world is going to require you defending it. And even if you lose that fight, you have already won. When we think about the connection of this, I didn't only look at it, these questions, in terms of what happened in North America. I look at it in the Caribbean, in South America, to Central America. I look at it in all over the African continent. I look at it in South Asia. I look at Australia. You know, these are ideas, the things I'm saying right now. Everything I just described is the struggle of an Australian Aboriginal.
That's right.
It's the struggle of the Shudras in India. Mm-hmm. It's the struggle of the indigenous peoples in South America. And when they decide to think through and take up these struggles, you know, may not realize this, but some people may imagine that they're going to turn to Saint Foucault or Saint Jacques Derrida or even Saint Marx. But what you all don't know is that's not what they do. And Professor Asante could attest to this because he's gone to these places. They turn to us.
That's right.
When I went to black townships in South Africa, if you have any idea what an African American jazz musician means to a black South African, or what an African American intellectual means. The first time I went to South Africa, it was at a conference, and it had a group of American philosophers. In fact, they had some of the people today who are like gods. It had Iris Young, it had, bless you. It had, just a name of all these folks. And it even had Charles Mills and Ed Me. And folks went and talked. And then when I gave my talk, and it was going back and forth with these white guys and a few of the other folks, I saw there was one black guy in the audience, and he left the room. So as I'm going, I'm in my head, if you're in South Africa and the one black guy in the room leaves the room, you're gonna be seriously concerned. But about 10 minutes later, he came back with 300 people. There were so many people that was in the room, and they went out into the hall. And as the whole session ended, and we went out, it was one of these things like, you ever been in these sports events where at the end they carry you out? And they dragged me out. And these folks in Grahamstown, South Africa, said, Dr. Gordon, I heard in the United States of America that a black professor had to be twice as good as a white professor. But we didn't know you had to be 4 times as good. I think that's the best compliment I've ever had. But they're saying something that we all know. We hear this twice as good nonsense, but we know it's not about twice as good. Because, we don't only carry our ideas and our books and our articles. We have to carry also the assaults on what it is for us to exist, period. Right. We also are the people who have to be nurturing for the abuse being done to our sisters and brothers who are students. Mm-hmm. We have to be the people who have to be there for our sisters and brothers who are secretaries, right. Who are custodial workers. Mm-hmm. And we have to be there for our children in our personal lives. Mm-hmm. We have to be there for so much that of course it can't be twice as good. It can't be 3 times. It really is 4 times as good. What are you saying about me is what are you saying about you and you and you and you and you and you and you. And in the midst of that, we have to understand then that when people say things about these ideas about, oh, you're doing that black stuff, it's particular, why don't you do universal work? Why don't we do more of the universal? What we know is that that is what we are, the real universal critique of this world. And that this other stuff that masks itself as a universal is a particular, that requires the subjugation of the rest of humanity in order to live its lie. So if we understand that, then what we understand is the next thing. If we don't even get into that debate, we understand the validity of what we do, we need to make a next move. It's not just a responsibility for responsibility, but this is very difficult, and I found this is very, very difficult for black intellectuals. We need to value being valued by each other.
That's right.
That is one of the things we need to do.
That's right.
You know, there are many awards and things out there, and there are people who act like if you were to get something from the more white establishment awards, it's somehow more legitimate. But you know, when we had that thing for DuBois over at Penn the other day because they were doing this posthumous thing, I brought up something that some people didn't get, which is there are a lot of people who run around and they want to find out, they fail to understand what DuBois valued. And there were people who were lamenting whether you had some Hall of Science or certain places with a small set of the economists and sociologists and those acknowledging and honoring DuBois. And while that within its professional terrain is important, what they didn't understand is what DuBois valued were all of those people in the streets of Philadelphia who showed up to that meeting
That's right.
because his ideas touched, moved them, and enabled them to walk through each day with dignity. I brought up as an example, in fact, when I saw Professor Asante in Jamaica. On our way to the Caribbean Philosophical Association meeting, which is a valuing of valuing each other. He was to get, he was to give a talk. He didn't know that he was being nominated to get the Frantz Fanon Award. But what I found important was along the way, there were all of these Rastafarian folks selling books and other things. And when I, along the way, said, this is Professor MOLEFI Asante, what it meant to them that Professor Asante was with them was absolutely marvelous. But what was important for me was not that. What was important for me was what it meant to Professor Asante, that those people selling and sitting in the corner who were not part of the university valued what he was doing. It's not that he disrespects the academic, because he is a professional academic. It's just that he understands that that is not enough.
That's right.
So I'm going to talk now about two exemplars of the kind of thing I'm suggesting in some of these ideas, and what I tend to write about in some of my books. One of them is Frantz Fanon, and the other one is Steve Biko. Fanon, it's hard to believe Fanon was 36 years old when he died. 36 years old. Fanon was, he was a war hero, fought in World War II. He was a person who believed that the assault on human dignity anywhere threats it everywhere. So he went and fought in World War II. And he came back disgusted because he found out that although for him there was just humanity, he found out that the Europeans that he and other Martinican soldiers were liberating would much rather celebrate their liberation with the Germans and the Italians who were the fascists attacking them than with the black soldiers who liberated them. And so Fanon noticed something very profound, that it doesn't matter how much you talk about the human and life, if someone's humanity specifically is not recognized, all the bets are off. So Fanon came back and he began to think about this. He went through the lycée system. He became a psychiatrist. He had all of the pedigree, all of the training to be a really complacent petty bourgeois black academic or a petty bourgeois black medical doctor. He could have gone to Montreal. He could have gone somewhere where he just sits down and deal with high-class neurotic people, make a living, and life is good. But as we know, Fanon ended up going to Algeria. He wanted to go to Senegal, but Senghor never answered his letters. So he went to Algeria, and we know he got involved in the Algerian struggle there. He ended up in Tunis, and he began to organize for African unity. He wanted to have a large African federal system. And he wanted Africans to get together and articulate a completely different conception for the future. But along the way, he also did something profound, because if that's only what he did, important as that is, it's back to the practice issue, he would be a very curious politician. But that young man, from the age of 25, wrote. He produced ideas. And those ideas included some of the things I'm talking about with you now. He asked, for instance, at the end of the day, what does it mean to be a human being? He said, you know what? Colonialism is not simply the colonizer coming in and colonizing people, but it's also coming in and wanting to colonize people in such a way that you won't need to have guns and other weapons anymore. In other words, colonization requires also colonizing the mind. There's nothing better than to make someone self-colonized, right? Let them do the work for you. And so Fanon thought about it, but even there, if you're going to decolonize the mind, you need also to deal with the very way the mind thinks. So for Fanon, decolonization required also dealing with the methodological presuppositions, the ways of thought themselves. And so for Fanon, there needed to be a radicality of critique. The other thing that Fanon did was that Fanon, in this radicality of critique, offered a very profound criticism. And that is this. You may have all heard this. You look at a lot of books, when you talk about racism, you hear about the other, the problem of the other. I don't want to be the other. I don't want to be the other. You know what Fanon's response was? Man, I wish I could at least even be the other. Because what racism really does is to structure a group of people in such a way that they're not selves and they're not even others. The reason lynchings could occur, the reason enslavement could occur, the reason why people who lose their everything over 10% unemployment, when for black people, and especially black males, it's over 47%. The only way people could go to bed at night without a worry in the world, when the greatest amount of incarceration in the history of humankind during peacetime is off the black population in this country, is if they do not take seriously that these are human beings. It means that we, in that formulation, are below even the other. And so the very problematic, the very question of what it is to engage in a liberation struggle against racism and colonialism, according to Fanon, is to recognize that if you're trying to prove that you are right in the terms of that system, you can only do so through not doing anything at all. In other words, the moment you're actional, the moment you stand up for yourself, you're asserting your right for you being a human being in a world that says that is illegal. It is illicit. It is wrong. You don't have the right to appear. So if you appear, it's a violation of that space. And so what Fanon said is, if you recognize that, then you realize that you have to fight for the conditions of your appearance in different terms. It means that you have to understand that what modern colonialism and racism have done is to create a world in which the ethical has to wait for the supervenance of the political to make ethical life possible. Every one of us here who struggles for that is ultimately a person who deeply believes in the ethical. Biko did, when he raised this question, was to raise something that was really profound. What Biko basically said, and it sounds banal, but this is really profound. He said, black consciousness is political. Now that sounds banal, but if you unpack it, here's what it means. If you live in a racist state, then the legitimacy of the state requires the illegitimacy of the groups the state is against. An anti-black racist state requires the non-appearance of black people. As a consequence, if you are going to assert at any moment the legitimacy or the appearance of black people, you are going to be violating the values of that state. Now, here's where the problem comes in. All politics requires speech. And so if you're going to articulate the speech, if you're going to articulate the conditions of blackness, if you're going to articulate the fact that it's a racist state, the state has to repress that speech. The state, in an attempt to repress that speech violently, is in fact in a war through its war on the category of black, going to speech, it is in a war then on politics itself. Now, if we understand this, now we understand why, no matter what we may say, every single black studies program in the United States of America, those in Europe, anywhere in the world, is political. Every single moment at which you assert the legitimacy of that category, it is political. And once we begin to understand that, we begin to understand back to that point about Fanon. Because it's a point about making appear that which the society has deemed lacking the right to appear. And so I'm going to close with an observation that I made in South Africa this summer. I was asked to speak at a conference on Ubuntu. Now, whenever you're asked to speak on Ubuntu or Uhuru or on any African concept, W.E.B, any African concept, there's a presupposition that you're going to have a conversation about something pre-modern and exotic. So when I came to the conference, even within the framework of South Africa, people were talking about traditional values, traditional laws, etc. So when I got up to speak, I said, that's a lot of bunk. And here's why. If that were correct, it would mean that when colonization occurred in Africa, Africans stopped thinking. And then when the colonial regimes are toppled, suddenly Africans decide to think, and they say, well, where did we leave off? It's the dumbest thing you could think of. I said, so let me give you a more plausible history. Colonialism comes in, the people are fighting against it, and the concepts they have continue, but they now are dealing with a new context. And so they enrich the concepts, and so Ubuntu is through and through today a modern concept.
That's right.
Uhuru, same thing. Once we understand that, now we ask a different question. Some people say, okay, if it's modern, what is it? Should it translate into, well, what is its equivalent, say, in the United States or in England or, And some people say, well, is it about justice, right? But that is a fallacy. And the reason it's a fallacy is because it presupposes that the European concept of justice is already complete normatively, and so you could just translate it into anything else that pops up, or anything else can translate into it. But what's missing there is that the word justice, from the word jus in Latin, well, if you go back to the Roman and Latins, it meant something completely different than what you have with the Greeks who had dikaisune. And people just presuppose when you read books on Plato and those that you just translate dikaisune, Plato and Aristotle, into juice, and then you just bring it up to someone like John Rawls, who was a big professor at Harvard, theory of justice. However, if you go and you look at dikaisune, it's peculiarly similar to Ma'at, the Egyptian, well, the Kemet concept, because even Egyptian, as we know, is not a Kemetian term. It's a name for Memphis, from Greek. So then when you say, okay, dikaisune is more like Ma'at, it's not that they're the same thing, but they're alike. Well, in Ma'at, you talk not only about balance, you also talk about truth, you talk about humanity, you talk about order. It's a rich concept. Well, when you talk about dikaisune, you talk about things being just right, order, so forth. And you begin to say, okay. But of course, other things happen along the way. Because you see, Greece, Rome were also imperial societies. And when they colonized Kemet, when they colonized Judea, it's not like the same story. It's not like these people sat down, stopped thinking, and then when Rome fell, they started thinking again. What they did was, with Judea, it created the concept of halakha. It created rabbinic Judaism. What was happening in North Africa and many other places were a variety of different ways of thinking to create a way to respond to their condition. When in South Africa, or whether it's in Yoruba land or Igbo land, they developed ways of responding. And within that framework, then, Ubuntu has to be looked at as such a way. And what's fascinating about Ubuntu is that Ubuntu, the reason it cannot neatly be put onto justice is because Ubuntu is being talked about because of a fundamental problem with justice. And here's the problem with justice. It's the same problem that happened in this country. You can fight a struggle like the civil rights struggle and have a moment of justice. You can have the moment of justice with the end of apartheid, but you can have the post-apartheid, the post-civil rights moment of the dehumanization of the people who made that struggle. The reason Ubuntu is talked about today is because in South Africa, a black South African is not treated fully as a human being. The reason we are talking today and we need alternative ways of dealing with our condition is because post-civil rights era, we got the Voting Rights Act, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we got all kinds of legislation. But what we don't have are the social conditions in which most black people can walk into a room as a human being. And that's why we can be incarcerated en masse. That's the way we can be unemployed en masse. South Africa, everything happened to us is happening to black people there. We know about the miners. And that is because what it means for the life of those people is something missing. And the example I give is this. If you go before the IMF or any big world, global entity and say you want justice, you want to talk about justice and poverty and all of this, they're going to say, okay, let's think about the productive yields, what kind of ways in which we can deal with distribution, blah, blah, blah. You notice that kind of a model? What did I not bring up at any moment? I didn't bring up the question of human beings. You go in there and say, you want Ubuntu. You can't now say, well, distribution, blah, blah, blah. You're going to have to say, okay, who is unemployed? Who is in poverty? Who is dealing with bad health care? Who is? And you say, these people are. Then you got to do something about these people. Ubuntu is about a profound aspect of what we could call African humanism. And that is that the normative life are what enable, that justice is just a portion of the larger picture of what we're struggling for as a species. What humanity struggles for is what I opened this talk with. It's for what it is to be able to get up, go through the world with dignity, with the understanding of the words, I am a human being. I'll stop there. Thank you.